Welcome to the Pardes channel. Today, we explain Prophets Kings 1, Chapter 11 in a clear and simple way, step by step. We're looking at what has to be one of the most stunning and honestly tragic turns of events in all of biblical history. Think about King Solomon. Here's a ruler who was gifted with literally unparalleled divine wisdom, immense wealth, and complete national peace. He had it all. But then, he experiences this devastating downfall. This chapter we're diving into today, it's the pivotal turning point. It's the exact moment where the golden age of a united Israel begins to crack and fracture. So let's explore exactly how and why this whole thing happened.
Okay, let's dive into this explainer. Here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at Solomon's wives and the resulting idolatry. Second, God's anger and judgment. Third, the adversaries that rise against the king. Fourth, the prophecy of Ahijah to Jeroboam. Fifth, our key simple ideas. And finally, number 6, some practical life lessons we can all take away.
Section 1. Solomon's Wives and Idolatry. Let's set the scene and look closely at the critical flaw that actually sets Solomon's downfall into motion.
So the text opens up by giving us a pretty massive detail. It tells us that King Solomon loved many foreign women. Alongside Pharaoh's daughter, he married women from the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. Now, the text makes an absolutely crucial point right here, rooting us firmly in the literal, historical context. God had directly commanded the Israelites not to intermarry with these specific nations. And the reason wasn't arbitrary. It was super clear. These nations worshipped other gods, and God warned that such marriages would for sure turn the people's hearts away to follow those idols. The Hebrew text uses this very specific, intense word regarding Solomon's attachment to these women, Babi Ahava, which means he clung to them in love. Over time, he amassed an almost unfathomable royal household. We're talking 700 wives of royal birth, plus 300 concubines. That's 1,000 women. And as Solomon grew older, the text is brutally honest. His wives turned his heart after other gods. His heart was no longer fully devoted to the Lord. It points out this really sharp contrast. His heart was not Lovav Shalem, a complete heart, unlike the complete devotion of his father, King David.
Verses 5 through 8 get really specific about what this divided heart actually looked like in everyday practice. Solomon didn't just quietly, passively allow his wives to worship their gods in private. He actively facilitated it, using his vast royal resources. He followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians. Then the text details this incredibly public geographical violation, right on a hill directly east of Jerusalem, which geographically is the Mount of Olives, standing literally in plain sight of the city and the shiny new temple he just built. Solomon actually built high places. In Hebrew, these are called bamot, meaning raised altars and shrines. He built these for Chemosh, which the text calls the shikuts, the detestable thing or abomination of Moab. He did his same for Molech, sometimes called Milcom, the detestable god of the Ammonites. The text tells us he did this for all his foreign wives, who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods right there. Wow, this was a profound, shockingly public violation of his covenant with God.
Section 2. God's anger and judgment. As you can imagine, such a public betrayal could not just be ignored.
The Lord became very, very angry with Solomon, and the text makes sure to emphasize exactly why this anger was so justified. God had actually appeared to Solomon twice before, once at Gibeon and again after the temple was completed. So this wasn't a king who was just ignorant of God's presence or commands. God had directly forbidden him to follow other gods, yet Solomon didn't listen. Therefore, God issues a really severe judgment, speaking to Solomon directly. Just listen to the weight of these words. Since this is your attitude, and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. The word subordinate or servant is totally critical here. Think about it. To a king of Solomon's unmatched earthly stature, losing his kingdom to his own servant, that is a massive, crushing insult.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the mercy wrapped inside this otherwise harsh judgment. God declares that the kingdom is going to be torn away, sure, but he adds 2 major foundational conditions. First, for the sake of David, Solomon's father, God will not do this during Solomon's lifetime. The physical tearing of the kingdom, that's going to happen out of the hand of Solomon's son. Second, God won't tear the whole kingdom away. He promises to leave one single tribe to Solomon's son. Now, just a quick clarification on the math of the literal text here. The tribe of Benjamin was geographically and politically totally intertwined with Judah, effectively functioning as a single loyal entity under the royal family. So, this remnant is preserved entirely for the sake of David, God's servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city God had chosen.
Section 3.
adversaries rise against Solomon. Let's look at the external consequences of Solomon's unfaithfulness.
While the ultimate loss of the kingdom is deferred to the next generation, Solomon's current peace is immediately shattered. Verses 14 through 22 detail the very first external adversary God raises up, a guy named Hadad the Edomite, who came from the royal line of Edom. Hadad's backstory is deeply detailed in the Hebrew text. Years earlier, when King David and his commander Joab were fighting in Edom, they struck down all the men there over the course of 6 long months. But Hadad, who was just a little boy at the time, managed to escape. He fled with some of his father's servants, trekked through Midian and Paran until they finally landed in Egypt. And down there, Hadad found immense favor with Pharaoh. We're talking royal treatment. Pharaoh gave him a house, provided him with a food allowance, and even granted him land. The favor was so over the top that Pharaoh actually gave Hadad his own sister-in-law, the sister of Queen Tahpenes, to be his wife. They even had a son named Gunabath, who was raised right there in Pharaoh's palace alongside Pharaoh's own kids. But when Hadad heard that both King David and Commander Joab were dead, he goes right up to Pharaoh. Despite Pharaoh asking him, "Wait, what have you lacked here that makes you want to go back to your own country?" Hadad insisted on returning to Edom. Why? Specifically to become a major thorn in Solomon's side.
But wait, Hadad wasn't the only threat on the horizon. In verses 23 through 25, the text shows us God raising up a second adversary, Rezon, the son of Eliada. Now, Rezon's hatred for Israel stemmed directly from King David's earlier military campaigns. Rezon had actually fled from his master, Hadadezer, king of Zobah, back when David was expanding his empire and slaughtering Zobah's forces. So Rezon gathers men around him, essentially becoming the warlord of a marauding band of rebels. They eventually travel to Damascus, settle there, and just take control of the entire region. The text explicitly points out that Rezon was Israel's adversary for as long as Solomon lived, perfectly compounding the trouble that Hadad the Edomite was already causing down south. The text even notes that Rezon loathed or utterly abhorred Israel. By ruling up there in Aram, he effectively cut off Solomon's northern trade routes and security. Basically, the era of perfect, unbroken shalom, that beautiful peace that defined the beginning of Solomon's reign, was officially shattered.
Section 4. Ahijah's prophecy to Jeroboam. We now meet the subordinate who's actually going to take the kingdom.
In verses 26 through 28, the text introduces us to Jeroboam, son of Nebat. He's an Ephraimite from a place called Zeradah, and his mother was a widow named Zeruah. Now, you've got to understand, Jeroboam wasn't just some random citizen off the street. He was a highly capable official working directly under King Solomon himself. The text gives us his resume. When Solomon was undertaking major building projects, specifically building the Millo, which were these supporting terraces or walls filling in the gaps in the city of David, Solomon noticed how incredibly industrious and capable this young man Jeroboam was. Recognizing his talent, Solomon actually promoted him. He put him in charge of the entire labor force of the house of Joseph. This is a really crucial detail. The house of Joseph means the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, which are the massive, powerful northern tribes. So suddenly, Jeroboam is this trusted insider with immense administrative and political power over a huge segment of the population.
Then comes this incredibly profound and dramatic encounter in verses 29 through 31. One day, Jeroboam is traveling out of Jerusalem, and he gets stopped on the road by a prophet named Ahijah from Shiloh. The text really emphasizes that the two of them are completely alone out there in the open countryside. Ahijah is wearing a brand new cloak, referred to in Hebrew as a salma. This new, unbroken garment beautifully represents the new, unified kingdom of Israel under David and Solomon. But then, suddenly, Ahijah grabs hold of his own new cloak and forcefully tears it into 12 separate pieces. It's this stark, intense, physical prophetic act. He then looks right at Jeroboam and commands him, "Take 10 pieces for yourself." And this brilliantly illustrates the tearing of the physical garment, literally representing God tearing the kingdom right out of Solomon's hand.
Continuing through verses 32 to 36, Ahijah explains the meaning of this torn cloak directly on behalf of God. God is giving Jeroboam 10 of the tribes of Israel to rule over, and the reason given is totally explicit, pointing back directly to the beginning of our chapter. It's because Solomon and the people have forsaken God to worship Ashtoreth, Chemosh, and Moloch, and they haven't walked in God's ways like David did. However, Ahijah reaffirms those conditions God established. God will not take the kingdom from Solomon himself, but from his son. And Solomon's son? He gets to retain one tribe, Judah, which, as we discussed, functionally absorbs Benjamin. The text explains exactly why this happens. It's so that David may always have a lamp, a continuing burning legacy, before God in Jerusalem, the very city where God chose to put his name.
Hadad then delivers an incredibly profound promise to Jeroboam in verses 37 through 39. God tells him, "If you do whatever I command you and walk in my ways and do what is right in my eyes by keeping my statutes and commands, as David my servant did, I will be with you." God actually offers Jeroboam a sure house, a permanent dynasty, one as enduring as the one built for David, and promises to give Israel to him. God states clearly that he's going to humble David's descendants because of Solomon's idolatry. But importantly, the literal text notes that this humbling will not be forever. It leaves the door wide open for the future redemption of David's royal line.
In verse 40, somehow word of this private prophecy reaches Solomon. And the irony here is just tragic. How does the supposedly wisest man on earth react? Well, not with repentance, right? When his father David was confronted by the prophet Nathan, David repented. But Solomon reacts with calculated violence. Solomon attempts to use his earthly political power to assassinate Jeroboam and thwart a direct prophecy from God? No way that's going to work. Jeroboam manages to escape. He flees south to Egypt, finding refuge with King Shishak. Shishak's name is actually super important here, setting the stage for future biblical conflicts. Jeroboam remains there in Egypt, safely hanging out in exile until the day King Solomon dies.
All right, that brings us to Section 5, Key Simple Ideas. Let's look at the foundational facts we can pull from the end of this chapter. The chapter officially closes out with verses 41 through 43. The text concludes by telling us that the rest of the events of Solomon's reign, all the things he did and his wisdom, are written in the Sefer Divrei Shlomo, the book of the Annals of Solomon, which was most likely an official court record. We learn that he reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel for exactly 40 years. Now, in biblical text, the number 40 frequently symbolizes a completed generation or a full divine era. After this, he rests with his fathers, is buried in the city of David, and his son Rehoboam succeeds him as king. Just like that, the 40-year golden era is definitively over, and all the pieces are now perfectly in place for the kingdom to be torn apart.
Let's synthesize the literal, simple ideas we've uncovered in this text today. First off, actions have direct, unavoidable consequences. Solomon's idolatry wasn't just a personal failing. It directly caused the physical loss of the unified kingdom. Second, God faithfully keeps his promises. He executes the punishment he warned about? Absolutely. But he also faithfully preserves a remnant for David, exactly as he promised. Third, we see that unchecked desires can compromise absolutely anyone. I mean, Solomon was the wisest man alive, yet his desire for foreign wives completely blinded him. Finally, the peace of the nation was directly tied to the leader's faithfulness. The moment Solomon strayed, external adversaries like Hadad and Rezon immediately appeared on the scene.
Moving on to our final section, Section 6, Practical Life Lessons. Let's talk about applying the truth of this text to our own lives. As we analyze this explainer, we have to remember it is not just history, it's a mirror. So the crucial point is how we manage our own hearts. First, we've got to guard our core values, especially as we age. Notice the text specifically stated that Solomon's heart turned as he grew old. Time does not automatically grant us immunity from terrible mistakes. Second, carefully choose who you allow to subtly influence you. Solomon's wives slowly turned his heart over time. The company we keep absolutely shapes our loyalties. Third, understand that our past mistakes can disrupt our current peace. God raised up adversaries like Hadad from Edom that Solomon's father had thought were dealt with long, long ago. Finally, stay humble. Early wisdom, early success, and early devotion, they do not guarantee a perfect finish. We have to work to maintain our faithfulness every single day.
When we step back and look at the beginning versus the end of Solomon's story, it is deeply, deeply sobering. He started out with a direct dialogue with God, receiving literally unparalleled divine wisdom, bringing unprecedented unity, architecture, and wealth to Israel. But because he allowed his heart to become divided among foreign gods, his reign ends with his kingdom destined to be physically divided and fractured. A divided heart ultimately led to a divided nation.
So I want to leave you with this thought to really reflect on today. What influences in your own life might be subtly turning your heart away from your core values? Thank you for learning with us. If this helped you understand the chapter better, like, subscribe, and join us for the next chapter.